why did Putin think that he could make war? And I think he thought he could make it because he thought he'd get away with it. And he had got away with it before. He'd got away with it when he seized Crimea. He had got away with it in Chechnya. He'd got away with it in Syria. He got away with it by threatening war against Georgia. And so he'd come to see war as a usable tool of state. And he assumed that Ukraine would not fight. I mean, that's very clear. I mean, I think, you look at that big Russian column that came into Ukraine, and they thought they were going to have simply an easy drive down to Kiev. They would be able to take the city over. There'd be no resistance. They'd set up a puppet government. There are stories, which I believe, because I've seen enough of them, that in the captured luggage that the Ukrainians captured of Russian officers, there were dress uniforms. And so they were planning a victory parade. Putin thought Ukraine was weak and divided and would not stand up to Russia. I think also what you have to take into account is his own sense of history, because he's thinking of a different history than many of his neighbors. And the history he's thinking of is of a great Russia. He wants to restore the greatest boundaries of Russia. And he has this view, and he said this in this rather long essay he wrote last summer, that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people spiritually, that the Ukrainians are part of the family and should be within the Russian tent. And Kiev, of course, and one of the ironies is Kiev is seen by Russian nationalists like Putin as the birthplace of Russia. And so in a curious way, he's prepared to destroy the birthplace in order to prove a point. I think also he thought the West would not respond. And he and many of those around him have come to think of the West as weak, divided, decadent. You notice that he goes on and on about the sort of social customs in the West. He talks about the ways in which gays are tolerated. This to him, same-sex marriage, this to him is a sign of weakness and decadence. And I think he's been very much surprised. I think if Trump was still president, then I think you would probably find a very different Western response. What I think has taken Russia by surprise are two things. First of all, the resistance of the Ukrainians, which, if anything, is growing. And second, the willingness of the West, certainly large parts of the West, led by the United States, to give them the supplies they need. And I think with a different president, if Trump had been elected for a second term, I suspect none of that would have happened. The United States would not have taken a leadership role. And so to go back to your original question, yes, at certain points, who's in power does really matter. I think Zelensky has been key. And of course, you can understand why Putin and others underestimated Zelensky. I mean, this was someone whose approval rating was, I think, about 28% when the war started. There were all sorts of problems in Ukraine, divided country, politically divided, problems with corruption. There were problems. And Zelensky was a former comic. And so I think most people wrote him off. They said, this guy, is a pushover. And I'm sure that's what Putin thought. And Zelensky has proved to be the man of the hour. And whatever you think of his leadership, it is clear to me that it's made a difference. And he has a great capacity to speak, not just to the Ukrainian people, which I think is very important. He's speaking to them, he's rallying them, he's making them come together or helping them come together. But he's also got a great capacity to speak to the West. And I think that is very important. And I think what he's done is make the West realize that it needs to defend its own values, its democratic values. Because one of the other things that Putin, I think, disliked a great deal about an independent Ukraine. Not only did he see it as illegitimate, but he saw it as a threat to his own rule, because having a neighbor like Ukraine, which was prospering for all its problems, it was doing better economically than Russia was. It was more democratic and open than Russia. And that's what he didn't want his own people to see. Now, the response in the West, I think, has been led by the United States, and Biden administration has been very firm on this, and they have gone a long way to supplying Ukraine with what it needs, but also to encouraging their allies to do the same. But the response is not just led by the United States, and I think that's important. I think one of the key things that happened is the reaction of Germany. Now, you can argue that's been too slow, and you can argue they should have been delivering weapons more quickly, but the Germans have reversed what has essentially been a policy of decades to spend more on the military, to take more of a leadership role. The fact that Sweden wants to join, Sweden and Finland want to join NATO, again, is an extraordinary reversal. I mean, this is something that would not have happened without this war. And so I think you're seeing a number of reactions in democratic countries, not always strong ones. I mean, there are democratic countries, or partly democratic countries, let's say partly democratic like Hungary, which prefer to try and trim and try and keep on good terms with Putin. And they've just had a delivery of Russian gas. And so in a way, it's paying off for them. But I think the reaction of the West has actually been surprisingly strong. And I think it's taken Putin by surprise. And of course, his only reaction really is to double down and try and seize even more territory and use even more brutal means.